Have you ever noticed that the loudest mysteries are the ones wrapped in silence? The ones where nothing is said, but everything feels off? The ones where the questions multiply faster than the answers? Let me ask you something directly, something people whisper in private chats, encrypted groups, and late-night forums. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What if the biggest unanswered royal mystery has nothing to do with coronations, scandals, affairs, or feuds, and everything to do with what wasn't seen? What wasn't heard? What wasn't photographed? What didn't happen? And what if the story the world has been fed for years is held together by threads so thin, so brittle, that one unexpected sentence, one accidental slip, could unravel everything? Because that's exactly what happened. It began on a perfectly ordinary day. No drama. No chaos. No hint that the media landscape was about to fracture. A standard broadcast. A royal spokesperson. A routine update. Something they'd done 1,000 times before. But this time something went wrong. Not wrong in the usual PR way, the kind where a statement is worded poorly or a phrase is open to interpretation. No, this was different. This time, something slipped. A sentence. A phrase. A moment that was supposed to be cut from the broadcast, but wasn't. Something that cracked open a conversation the palace never wanted to have. Something that made millions pause, rewind, replay, and whisper, "Wait, what did they just say?" Because what they said, or almost said, didn't fit the story, didn't match the narrative, didn't align with the picture-perfect version of events that had been carefully curated for years. And suddenly, people began noticing things they'd ignored before. Little details, odd silences, strange inconsistencies, timelines that didn't align, photos that felt out of place, public events where something felt missing, statements that sounded rehearsed, smiles that seemed strained, and an absence, an unmistakable, lingering absence, so thick it practically echoed. You ever feel it? That gut-level awareness that something simply isn't adding up? Because once that slip happened, the questions started pouring in again. Old questions, new questions, questions no one wanted to touch, questions journalists avoided, questions palace aides dodged, questions the public had learned to bury. Until now. Because here's the truth. Once a crack appears, you can't unsee it. Once a thread unravels, you can't rewind it. Once the narrative starts wobbling, you can't pretend it's solid. And that is exactly what happened after that broadcast. People started revisiting old footage, news clips, interviews, official photos, public appearances, statements from spokespeople, press releases. And the more they looked, the more contradictions they found. Contradictions no one had dared to examine before. Contradictions so glaring that they raised one explosive question, a question that would dominate the next several chapters of this story. How is it possible that something so public is somehow so unprovable? The broadcast triggered a chain reaction. Reporters who had ignored the whispers now whispered them to colleagues. Producers who dismissed rumors now quietly archived footage to review later. Fans who once defended everything now paused with unease. And skeptics, the ones who had been laughed at, mocked, dismissed, now returned to the conversation with one devastating line. I told you so. But let's zoom out for a moment, because before we dive deep, and we will dive deep, let me ask you a few things directly. Have you ever wondered why certain public figures are surrounded by endless photos, yet others somehow aren't? Have you ever questioned why events that should be overflowing with documentation mysteriously lack it? Have you ever thought about how strange it is when highly publicized milestones leave almost no digital footprint? Have you noticed the way the media sometimes oversells something to the point where it begins to feel like they're trying too hard? Have you felt that uncomfortable tension between what you're told and what you actually see? Because in this fictional dramatized investigation, that tension becomes the entire backbone of the story. This isn't a tale about proof. This is a tale about absence. This isn't a story about what exists. It's a story about what doesn't. This isn't an expose about sightings. It's an expose about the quiet, unsettling void where sightings should be. And it all ties back to one shocking moment, one inexplicable comment, one accidental broadcast that forced Buckingham Palace to scramble, publicly and privately, to contain the fallout. But here's the real question you should be asking right now. Why? Why scramble? Why correct something so aggressively? Why deny something no one even asked? Because when institutions panic, they reveal more than they hide. And that's where our story begins. With a crack in the facade, a comment that shouldn't exist, and a growing storm of questions that no one seems prepared to answer. Each chapter ahead will peel back another layer. A timeline discrepancy here, a mysterious absence there, a neighbor's strange comment, an event with no witnesses, a photograph with odd visual inconsistencies, a media moment that doesn't fit, a silence that becomes deafening. Piece by piece, the illusion begins to flicker. Piece by piece, the narrative begins to fray. Piece by piece, the story shifts from odd to questionable to unsettling. And yet, we're still at the surface. Because before we even get to chapter 4, the story will twist. Before chapter 7, it will escalate. Before chapter 10, it will explode. And by chapter 15, well, you'll see. Right now, we're just setting the stage. We're laying out the emotional stakes, the contradictions, the inconsistencies, the atmosphere, the quiet unease that builds slowly, then suddenly, the sense that something is about to snap, the awareness that this isn't just a story, it's a puzzle with missing pieces, a puzzle with hidden pieces, a puzzle with pieces that don't belong. And every single one of those pieces points toward the same unsettling fictional mystery, the strange silence behind Montecito's walls. But before we cross that line, before we go down the rabbit hole that has divided the internet for years, we must return to that broadcast, the spark, the catalyst, the moment that turned a whisper into a roar. Because when Buckingham Palace spoke on air, when those words slipped, when the world replayed the clip in disbelief, everything changed. And what came next would change everything again, and no one, absolutely no one, saw it coming. Have you ever noticed how the quietest moments often carry the loudest consequences? That's exactly what happened after that broadcast, because the instant those unintended words echoed across the nation, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a vibration beneath the surface of a calm lake. A change that wasn't visible yet, but felt. A change that made people sit up straighter, turn up the volume, replay the footage again and again, asking themselves, wait, did they really say that? And here's the thing. When millions of people question the same moment at the same time, the air around the story becomes electric, charged, unstable, because now, the narrative isn't being controlled from the palace. It's being controlled by curiosity, by doubt, and by the sudden realization that something more might be hiding beneath the veneer of royal perfection. And let me ask you this. Why do the biggest cracks appear only after the smallest slip? Why does one tiny, unexpected detail make an entire story wobble? Why was this broadcast, this one routine, unremarkable update, the moment that changed everything? Because it didn't just introduce a contradiction. It revealed a pattern of silence, a pattern of avoidance, a pattern of details that had never made sense in the first place. People didn't notice those details before because they had no reason to. But once the seed of doubt was planted, once the illusion was interrupted, the inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. The palace didn't help themselves either. Their immediate reaction wasn't calm reassurance. It wasn't steady clarification. It wasn't the poised, polished composure they were famous for. No. Instead, what followed was a flurry, swift, clumsy, and almost frantic. A correction issued within minutes. An official statement released within the hour. And a second correction issued later that evening. Why? Why 3 attempts to fix something they claimed was nothing? Why such urgency over a mistake that should have been insignificant? Think about that. Really think about it. When someone tries that hard to convince you something isn't a big deal, doesn't it usually mean it is? The public felt it. The press felt it. Even social media, usually loud, chaotic, unpredictable, fell into a strange hush for a moment, as if everyone sensed something had just slipped out that wasn't supposed to. And as more people began dissecting the broadcast, the palace's frantic attempts to bury the moment only amplified the suspicion. Instead of smoothing things over, they made the air thicker, heavier, more electric. Because now, this wasn't just about what was said. It was about why they were trying so hard to make everyone forget it. Let me pose another question. Have you ever tried to hide something? only to realize that hiding it made it 10 times more obvious? That's exactly the energy the palace radiated in the hours that followed. Every statement they released was too sharp, too defensive, too forced. Every correction contradicted the one before it. Every carefully chosen phrase carried the unmistakable panic of people trying to put a fire out with gasoline. And as contradictions piled up, the public didn't just notice, they began connecting dots. Dots that shouldn't have aligned. Dots that pointed to gaps. Dots that hinted at a bigger story behind the curtain. And this is where things got interesting. Because just when the palace seemed to think they had regained control, just when they expected the fuss to die down, a new problem emerged. A problem they didn't anticipate. A problem they couldn't manage. A problem they had no script prepared for. An insider. Someone who had seen too much. Someone who didn't buy the palace's frantic corrections. Someone who believed the slip-up wasn't an accident at all. Their message didn't come through a public channel. It didn't leak through the press. It arrived quietly, anonymously, and chillingly, addressed to a single producer who had worked on that fateful broadcast. And the message contained only one short line, a line simple enough to ignore, yet heavy enough to make the producer's pulse spike instantly. Look at what's missing, not what's shown. Imagine reading that. Imagine knowing you were part of a broadcast that triggered a nationwide storm, only to receive a cryptic message suggesting you hadn't even scratched the surface. What would you feel? Curiosity? Fear? Responsibility? All of them. Because this producer felt all three. And instead of deleting the message and pretending it never existed, which would have been the safer, smarter choice, they made a decision that would escalate the story far beyond anything they expected. They started digging. Quietly, carefully, methodically. They reviewed the footage frame by frame. They revisited past statements from palace officials. They cross-referenced timelines. They studied patterns. And with every new detail they uncovered, one uneasy truth became clearer and clearer. There were too many things that didn't align. Too many moments that didn't make sense. Too many contradictions that couldn't be explained away. And this producer, now unable to unsee what they had seen, began connecting the dots the palace hoped would remain scattered. But here's the twist. The deeper the producer went, the stranger the inconsistencies became. Because these weren't small details. These weren't minor slip-ups. These were glaring, structural gaps in the story the world had accepted without question for years. Gaps that shouldn't have existed. Gaps that pointed to one overarching theme: absence. Not mistakes. Not confusion. Not poor communication. Absence. Absence so pronounced, so repeated, so consistent, that it began to paint a completely different picture. And yet, even now, we're still only scratching the surface. Because the producer wasn't the only one who noticed. Across the country, across the internet, across the world, thousands of others began asking the same chilling question. How can something be so public, and yet so invisible? That question didn't fade. It grew. It spread. It ignited forum threads. It revived old debates. It reopened long-dismissed rumors. And suddenly, what had been a silent corner of the internet exploded into a wildfire of speculation. The palace tried to put it out. They issued more corrections, more clarifications, more statements dripping with polished, press-tested sincerity. But none of it worked. If anything, it fanned the flames. Because at this point, it wasn't about the correction. It wasn't about the slip. It wasn't even about the topic itself. It was about something much bigger. The realization that the narrative had cracks, and those cracks were now too large to ignore. And here's where the story takes its first real turn. Because as the public was focused on the palace's clumsy corrections, as social media debated the broadcast, and as journalists quietly investigated the contradictions, something unexpected happened. A second insider stepped forward. Not anonymously, not cryptically, not subtly. This one spoke directly. And what they revealed made the first insider's message look insignificant. But what they revealed wasn't the real shock. The real shock was what they hinted at. Because what they hinted at didn't just question a detail or contradict a timeline. It challenged the entire foundation of the narrative itself. And what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. And maybe that's the most unsettling part about this entire fictional saga. The people who stepped forward weren't attention seekers, weren't disgruntled employees, and weren't desperate for relevance. They were quiet, composed, and unnervingly precise. And the second insider, the one who chose to speak with a name and a face instead of a shadow and a whisper, didn't come with documents or footage or explosive leaks. No, they came with something far more dangerous: questions. Sharp, surgical, impossible to ignore questions. Questions that struck at the soft spots of the narrative like a scalpel pressing against tissue. And with every question they asked, the palace's carefully woven explanations began to split like old stitching. Their interview wasn't dramatic. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't frantic or accusatory. It was calm, almost too calm. And that made it even more unnerving. Because in the world of royal PR, panic is expected. Composure is expected. But a quiet calm. A calm that suggests someone has been holding back the truth for years. That's the one thing no one knows how to handle. That's the one thing that sends shockwaves deeper than any scandal ever could. And let me ask you this. When someone publicly poses questions the institution can't answer, what does that tell you? Does it tell you the institution is innocent, transparent, confident, or does it tell you the exact opposite? Does it suggest there are things they desperately want to avoid? Things they don't want the public thinking too hard about? Things buried beneath layers of polished statements and choreographed appearances? Because in this fictional world, that's exactly the feeling that swept through the public. A slow, creeping realization that the palace wasn't defending itself because it was right. It was defending itself because it was cornered. The questions from the second insider were simple but devastating. Why were certain public events never documented beyond 1 or 2 controlled images? Why were timelines inconsistent in press releases? Why did official statements contradict previous official statements? Why did so many public appearances feel curated rather than natural? And most damning of all, why did the palace work so aggressively to shut down harmless curiosity? These weren't accusations, they were observations. Observations framed so carefully that the palace couldn't dismiss them without drawing more attention. Observations that forced people to re-examine years of public moments with new eyes. And the re-examination didn't go well. Because the deeper people looked, the stranger the inconsistencies became. Not subtle inconsistencies, not minor errors, but glaring irregularities, the kind you don't notice when you aren't looking for them, but become impossible to ignore once you are. It was like finding fingerprints everywhere after dusting a room that looked spotless for years. And now that the dust had settled, everything looked different. Everything felt different. Everything sounded different. Suddenly, the broadcast slip wasn't just a mistake. It was the starting pistol, the trigger, the moment that opened the door and allowed years of lingering questions to spill into the open. And what made the entire situation even more chaotic was the palace's reaction. They had 2 choices: dismiss the questions calmly or confront them strategically. Instead, they did neither. They doubled down. They pushed harder. They released more statements. They tightened their tone. They amplified their defensiveness. And in doing so, they created the exact opposite effect of what they wanted. People began wondering, why would an institution with nothing to hide treat every question like an attack? Why would they expend so much energy correcting something they claimed was insignificant? Why would they resist transparency on something so basic? And why, in the middle of all this, did they avoid giving clear, simple answers? Think about your own life for a moment. If someone asked you a harmless question, your birthday, your hometown, your job title, you wouldn't panic. You wouldn't get defensive. You wouldn't stumble over your words. You'd answer calmly, effortlessly, because the truth is easy to repeat. But when someone asks you something you don't want to answer, something that touches a nerve, something that exposes a story you've been trying to protect, that's when the panic kicks in. That's when the explanations become messy. That's when the defensiveness appears. That's when the contradictions start showing. And that's exactly the pattern the fictional palace fell into. The public felt it. They sensed the inconsistency. They sensed the fear. They sensed the urgency behind every sudden correction. And once people sense fear in a powerful institution, they start chasing whatever that institution is trying to hide. Not because they're malicious, not because they're obsessed, but because humans are wired to look for the truth. And when someone tries too hard to block your view, your first instinct is to lean in. And so that's what people did. They leaned in. Hard. They revisited events from years ago. They rewatched interviews. They studied old photos with a fresh perspective. They noticed background details they had never paid attention to. They questioned inconsistencies they once shrugged off. They connected dots they once dismissed as coincidence. And every time they dug deeper, the fictional narrative became murkier, more complicated, more tangled, like a web that had been spun quickly without expecting anyone to examine its structure. Meanwhile, the palace scrambled behind the scenes, or at least, that's what it looked like. More statements, more denials, more attempts to reframe the narrative, more pressure placed on media outlets to correct misinformation. But none of it worked, because by this point, the story had expanded beyond their control. It wasn't a rumor anymore. It wasn't a fringe theory anymore. It wasn't even a question anymore. It was a movement powered by curiosity, a movement powered by contradiction, a movement powered by the palace's inability to give a straight answer. And movements like that don't die quietly. They grow, they spread, they evolve. And that's exactly what happened here, because just when the palace thought they had contained the fire, just when they thought they had regained control, just when they thought the public would get bored and move on, a third insider appeared. This one didn't leave messages. This one didn't give interviews. This one didn't hint. This one didn't imply. This one provided something far more potent. Evidence, but not the kind the palace ever expected. And what that evidence revealed, well, but what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever witnessed a moment so ordinary, so routine, so painfully predictable, that the last thing you expect is for it to crack open a mystery the entire world had forgotten to keep questioning? That's exactly how this chapter begins. Not with drama, not with an explosion, not with a scandal, but with a routine palace update, the kind that blends into every other news segment, the kind the audience barely registers as background noise, the kind producers run on autopilot. And yet, somehow, in the space of a single breath, this ordinary moment shattered the illusion that had comfortably wrapped itself around the royal narrative for years. Picture this scene. Early morning broadcast. Calm music. A soft-lit studio. A presenter with the perfect neutral smile. The kind of segment that airs so often it becomes invisible. And sitting across from the presenter is the palace's spokesperson, composed, polished, predictable. A human press release. Someone whose job isn't to speak, but to repeat. Someone whose life revolves around carefully prepared lines. But on this day, the lines failed. The script faltered. And in the tiny gap between what was written and what was spoken, the world glimpsed something it wasn't supposed to see. It started with a question the presenter didn't mean to ask. A question that wasn't on the cue card. A question that slipped out naturally, casually, innocently, and yet carried a weight the palace wasn't ready to lift. And how are things on the home front? They asked, tone light, smile bright, unaware that this simple question was about to trigger a chain reaction. You could almost feel the spokesperson blink too slowly, breathe too deeply, hesitate half a second too long. And that hesitation, that fraction of a second, exposed a fracture that had gone unnoticed for years. Because instead of answering immediately, instead of delivering the usual polished line, the spokesperson faltered. And in that falter, the truth, or at least a truth, slipped through. A sentence half-spoken, a phrase half-formed. A thought that should have died in the privacy of their mind, but accidentally escaped live on air. Well, there hasn't been much presence, they said before catching themselves, straightening their posture, clearing their throat, and scrambling to repair the sentence with something safe, something neutral, something approved. But it was too late. The sentence was out. The tone was wrong. The hesitation was suspicious. The correction was frantic. And the presenter knew it. The crew knew it. The audience knew it. You know how sometimes a single off note in a piece of music suddenly makes you hear the entire song differently? That's what this moment was. One off note in an otherwise perfect performance. And suddenly the entire symphony sounded flawed. You could practically feel the collective jolt ripple across the studio, across the viewers at home, across the internet. People were tweeting clips before the spokesperson finished their sentence. Producers were replaying the audio in their earpieces. Editors were already clipping the moment for online upload. And the palace, watching live from their media room, froze, realizing instantly that something irreversible had just happened. Because the spokesperson's correction didn't help. It made it worse. Much worse. They backtracked with such forced enthusiasm, such strained optimism, such desperate overcompensation that the attempt to cover the slip became even more suspicious than the slip itself. They smiled too wide. Their voice lifted too high. Their hands gestured too much. And the more they tried to bury the mistake, the more obvious it became. The internet exploded. Not in anger, not in outrage, but in fascination. The kind of fascination that spreads like wildfire because it feeds on curiosity, not conflict. People clipped the video, slowed it down, transcribed it, zoomed in on the spokesperson's face, analyzed micro-expressions. The broadcast had turned into a forensic investigation, all because of one phrase. There hasn't been much presence. Presence of what? Presence of whom? Presence where? The palace should have stayed silent, should have let the moment fade, should have trusted that the public would move on. But they didn't. They panicked. And panic is the one thing that turns a spark into an inferno. First came the official statement. Not an apology, not a clarification, but a stiff, overly formal correction that insisted the spokesperson misspoke. But here's the thing. People don't issue formal statements over misspoken pronouns or misplaced pauses. The palace was treating the slip like a national crisis. And that alone made the public more suspicious. Then came the second statement. More defensive, more agitated, more insistent. The kind of statement that sounded like it was written in a hurry, under pressure, with too many people shouting at once. A statement that contradicted the first. And then came the third, a late-night edition, dripping with carefully rehearsed sincerity, but wobbling under the weight of its own contradictions. 3 statements for one tiny slip? Ask yourself why. Why would a small moment require such dramatic containment? Why would the palace scramble so aggressively? Why would they fear one accidental phrase so much? What was wrong with the word presence? And more importantly, what was missing from that presence? But the real turning point didn't come from the palace's reaction. The real turning point came from the public. The moment people rewatched the clip, not once or twice, but dozens of times, something clicked. Because the spokesperson's tone wasn't vague. It wasn't uncertain. It wasn't confused. It was tired. Tired in the way someone sounds when they've repeated a narrative for years and a crack finally forms in their patience. Tired in the way someone slips when they're exhausted by maintaining a story that doesn't quite align with reality. And that fatigue, that tiny vocal tremor, was the element that changed everything. It was the tremor that sparked the producer's curiosity. It was the tremor that revived old online threads. It was the tremor that led to forums creating side-by-side comparisons of past palace statements. It was the tremor that made journalists dig into archives. It was the tremor that finally made people ask, why does this story sound different when you replay it? And that's when the first insider reached out. The one who sent the cryptic message. The one who said, look at what's missing, not what's shown. But before that message arrived, before the avalanche of questions, contradictions, and revelations, something else happened. Something subtle. Something almost imperceptible. Something only one person in the entire production room noticed. A look. A single, fleeting, unmistakable look that flashed across the spokesperson's eyes the moment the presenter asked about the home front. Not fear. Not annoyance. Not confusion. But recognition. Recognition of a question they hoped would never be asked again. Recognition of a truth they hoped would stay buried. Recognition of a story beginning to unravel. And that look, that millisecond of human truth, was captured in crisp high definition and broadcast to millions. It was the look that changed everything. And what came after that look would make the slip seem small. Because the producer who saw it, the producer whose curiosity was now a roaring flame, they weren't ready for what the footage would reveal when they slowed it down, dissected it, and played it back frame by frame. And no one, absolutely no one, was ready for what they discovered next. Because when the producers slowed down the footage, when they leaned in, headphones on, eyes narrowed at the screen, they noticed something that wasn't visible at full speed. Something subtle. Something tucked in the corner of the frame. Something that the live audience never had time to catch. The spokesperson's hand. Not the hand gesturing. Not the hand resting calmly on the armrest. But the hand beneath the table. The one clenched so tightly into a fist that the knuckles had gone pale. A fist hidden from the camera's primary angle, but caught in the edge of a wide shot for just 2 seconds. 2 seconds that told a story no official statement could ever erase. Ask yourself, what kind of question makes a person's body tense like that? What kind of subject makes someone brace physically, instinctively, subconsciously, even before they speak? What kind of truth presses so heavily on someone's mind that their body reacts faster than their mouth? The producer replayed the moment dozens of times. Each time, the fist tightened, the jaw locked, the eyes darted. It was the face of someone struggling to keep a story intact. Someone who feared what might happen if they slipped even 1 inch further. Someone who had rehearsed the official narrative so many times that the weight of it had become unbearable. And that was when the producer realized the correction wasn't the accident. The original slip was the truth. But the real revelation didn't come from the footage. It came from the reaction the producer felt in their own gut, that instinctive tightening that happens when a story doesn't align with the evidence. They had worked on royal segments for years. They had interviewed dozens of palace staff. They knew the rhythms, the patterns, the polished composure. And this wasn't that. This wasn't polished. This wasn't composed. This wasn't routine. This was someone struggling to hold the dam together. And the cracks were widening. Within hours, the clip was trending. Within 12 hours, forums were dissecting every pixel. Within 24 hours, commentary channels were speculating on the slip's real meaning. And within 48 hours, the palace entered full, unmistakable crisis mode. They didn't want anyone rewatching the clip. They didn't want anyone analyzing the hesitation. They didn't want anyone staring too closely at the spokesperson's trembling hand. They wanted the moment forgotten, erased from the public consciousness. But in their attempt to erase it, they only magnified it. Because nothing fuels curiosity more than the sense that someone is trying to take something away. And so people started digging deeper. Much deeper. Old interviews were pulled up. Past statements were compared side by side. Royal correspondents who had previously brushed off questions were suddenly writing long, hesitant columns tiptoeing around the issue. Even archive footage, the kind that had been stored away, never expected to resurface, was now being rewatched in slow motion. And every clip raised more questions. Questions no one wanted to answer. Questions that kept circling back to one central theme: absence. The absence of ordinary moments. The absence of natural appearances. The absence of spontaneity. The absence of something that should have been simple, undeniable, consistently visible. The tension escalated further when the first insider's message, "Look at what's missing, not what's shown," reached the producer's inbox. The producer read it once, twice, a third time. The words weren't threatening. They weren't dramatic. They weren't sensational. They were observational, almost surgical, and that alone made them pulse with significance. What was missing? What had been missing for years? What had the palace never shown, and why? Those questions burrowed into the producer's mind like splinters. They couldn't focus. They couldn't sleep. They couldn't let it go. Because now the broadcast wasn't just a segment, it was a doorway. A doorway into a mystery that had been strategically ignored. But here's where this story truly begins to twist. Because the producer, convinced they were dealing with a disgruntled or paranoid former employee, decided to verify the message. They traced the IP. They checked metadata. They cross-referenced timestamps. And what they discovered was not some anonymous troll, not a hacker, not a prankster, but a location ping. A location deep inside an administrative wing of the palace's media office. Meaning someone internal, someone with access, someone with proximity, had sent the warning. Before the producer could process what that meant, before they could decide whether to respond, before they could even take a breath, a second message arrived. This one wasn't cryptic. It wasn't vague. It was chillingly direct. You're looking in the wrong place. Start with the dates. And that was the moment everything shifted. Because when the producer did exactly that, when they began auditing dates from old press releases, comparing them to public appearances, matching them against official calendars, the cracks didn't just widen. They split open. Some dates didn't align. Some statements referenced events that didn't occur. Some press photos appeared before the event they supposedly came from. Some timelines contradicted earlier timelines. Some moments simply had no documentation at all. Not little documentation. Not sparse documentation. None. Zero. A void where evidence should have been. And once the producer noticed it, the void seemed everywhere. And that void, that silent, empty, unsettling void led straight back to the spokesperson's slip. Their weary hesitation, their clenched fist, their desperate correction, because now everything began to fit together in a way that wasn't comfortable. Not for the palace, not for the press, not for anyone who relied on the official narrative. And here's the detail that pushed everything over the edge. When the producer attempted to confirm one of the older dates through a contact inside the palace, a routine request, something they had done countless times before, the response they received was unusually short, unusually tense, unusually fast. Do not inquire about that date again. Not, I'll check. Not, that's incorrect. Not, we'll update the record. Just a warning. A warning disguised as a polite directive, but a warning nonetheless. That was the moment the producer realized the palace wasn't just nervous. They were afraid. Afraid of questions. Afraid of timelines. Afraid of what people might uncover if they started digging too deeply. And fear like that doesn't come from nothing. Fear like that comes from a truth that can't withstand scrutiny. Fear like that comes from a story that begins to collapse when examined. And the collapse was already underway. Because right as the producer found the first major timeline inconsistency, right as they began lining up the contradictions, right as the mystery shifted from curiosity to alarm, a second insider stepped forward. This one didn't hide. This one didn't whisper. This one didn't warn. This one spoke directly. And what they revealed would make everything that happened so far seem like a mere prologue, a warm-up to the real storm. Because they weren't questioning slips. They weren't questioning dates. They weren't questioning details. They were questioning the entire foundation. But before their interview aired, before their words hit the public, before the palace could brace for impact, something even more shocking happened. Something caught on camera. Something absolutely no one expected. Something that would push this fictional investigation from confusion into chaos. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever watched someone try so hard to fix a mistake that the fixing becomes a bigger mistake than the original slip? That's exactly what happened the moment the palace attempted to correct the broadcast. You'd think a centuries-old institution with a billion-dollar aura of control would know how to put out a small PR fire. But instead, they fanned it. They didn't dampen suspicion, they drenched it in gasoline. And the public didn't just notice. They smelled the smoke. They saw the sparks. They recognized the heat of panic radiating from an institution that suddenly didn't seem so steady, so confident, so untouchably polished anymore. Because the first correction was awkward, the second was defensive, but the third felt frightened. And that's when the questions began to multiply. Why issue 3 corrections if the first one explained everything? Why release statements that contradicted one another? Why address a non-issue with such escalating seriousness? Why did the language shift from casual reassurance to borderline alarm? If the palace wanted to steady the narrative, they accomplished the opposite. Their corrections made the slip look intentional. Their explanations made the hesitation look meaningful. Their insistence made the word presence feel like a missing puzzle piece instead of a meaningless phrase. And the more they tried to tighten their grip, the more the narrative slipped through their fingers. But the real chaos began the moment the third correction hit the airwaves. You know that feeling when you're watching a magician perform a trick you've seen 1,000 times, but suddenly the magician fumbles, and for a split second you glimpse how the trick actually works? That's exactly how the third correction felt. A moment where the curtain fluttered. A moment where the illusion faltered. A moment where the audience sensed something underneath the surface. And once the illusion cracks, you can't pretend you didn't see the glitch. The palace spokesperson stood at the podium, voice steady but eyes strained. They repeated the revised answer. They emphasized how everything is as expected. They overused the word normal until it no longer sounded like a description, but a plea. And their body language, stiff, tight, almost rigid, betrayed the calm they tried to project. It was the type of composure that's held together, not by confidence, but by fear of falling apart. And the public picked up on it instantly. Because the human mind is incredibly good at detecting micro-hesitations, subtle inconsistencies, and unusual tightness in someone's voice. People felt it. They didn't need expertise. They didn't need analysis. They just knew. Something about the correction felt off. Too polished. Too manufactured. Too desperate to rewrite what had already happened. Then came the contradiction. A journalist asked a simple, harmless, predictable follow-up question. Something any spokesperson should have answered automatically. Something so routine it didn't require thinking. Can you clarify what you meant during the original response? And the spokesperson's answer was cold, clipped, and rehearsed. I said nothing unusual. I corrected myself immediately. But that's not what had happened. And everyone knew it. People rewound the footage. They replayed the slip. They compared it to the correction. And they saw it. The difference wasn't just in the words. It was in the tone. The slip carried truth. The correction carried fear. And the third correction carried something far worse. Pressure. Pressure from whom? Pressure for what? Pressure to hide what? Before anyone could digest that contradiction, another appeared, a much bigger one. In the second paragraph of the palace's official statement, they referenced a detail that had never been mentioned on air. Something no one heard. Something that didn't exist in the original clip. It was as if they were correcting a mistake that hadn't happened publicly. As if they were addressing a comment that was removed before broadcast. As if they were reacting to footage that didn't air. And for the first time, people wondered, was the slip even the real issue? Or was the palace terrified of something that almost slipped? Something the spokesperson nearly said? Something the palace managed to cut, except for one fragment? Because if the palace was correcting something the public never heard, then what exactly were they trying to cover? That was the question that ignited a different kind of curiosity. Not the superficial kind. Not the gossipy kind. The investigative kind. The kind that digs. The kind that questions patterns instead of moments. The kind that begins to examine the palace not as a royal symbol, but as a machine that had just malfunctioned. Meanwhile, the producer who received the insider messages revisited the full raw footage, not the edited broadcast file, but the untouched master file captured directly from all the cameras. And that was when they discovered something the public had never seen. In the portion of the interview that aired, the spokesperson began to say, well, there hasn't been much, before catching themselves. But in the raw audio, there was a faint continuation, a whisper, almost inaudible beneath the presenter's next question. A word. A single word. The producer had to isolate the audio, enhance it, slow it to half speed, replay it with noise reduction, and even then it was barely there. But it was unmistakable. Activity. Not presence. Activity. Activity where? Activity of what? Activity from whom? The difference between presence and activity might seem small, but in the world of official messaging, it's massive. Presence refers to existence. Activity refers to movement, involvement, engagement. And the spokesperson's tone made it clear they weren't talking about public duties. They were talking about something else. Something internal, something private, something the question had accidentally brushed up against. The producer stared at the waveform on their screen, heart pounding, the room suddenly too quiet. Because now the slip wasn't just a slip. Now it wasn't even a contradiction. Now it was a revelation, buried under panic and corrections. This was the moment the producer realized the palace wasn't correcting misinformation. They were trying to stop a narrative before it even started. But why? Before the producer could answer that question, before they could process the significance of the word activity, before they could decide what to do next, the second insider appeared. They didn't send a message. They didn't leave a voicemail. They didn't hide behind anonymity. They walked straight into a newsroom, sat down, removed their coat, looked the journalist in the eye, and said, I think it's time the public knew. The newsroom froze. Phone stopped ringing. Keyboard stopped clicking. Conversation died instantly. Because this insider wasn't a minor staffer. They weren't a seasonal consultant. They weren't an assistant. They were someone who had been in the room where decisions were made, the room where statements were crafted, the room where the official narrative was rehearsed. And the journalist interviewing them knew instantly, absolutely instantly, that this interview would not be small. But the insider didn't start with accusations. They didn't start with outrage. They didn't start with emotional claims. They started with questions. Questions that matched the producers. Questions that echoed the public's. Questions that tightened the pressure around the palace even further. And right before they revealed the first contradiction, the one that would shift the investigation into high gear, the palace did something unexpected. Something bold. Something no one predicted. They made a move that confirmed the public's worst suspicion. They were terrified. How do we know? Because the palace attempted to stop the interview, mid-recording. And what the palace did next? would ignite the biggest fictional media firestorm the monarchy had ever faced. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever witnessed a moment where silence becomes louder than sound, where the air grows so tense that even the quiet hum of a newsroom feels deafening? That's exactly what happened when the insider, the second insider, the one who walked in without disguise, without anonymity, without hesitation, took a seat in the interview room. This wasn't a whisper in an inbox. This wasn't a cryptic message sent from the shadows. This was a person stepping into the light, ready to speak, ready to be seen, ready to say the one thing the palace hoped no one would ever say. There's something you've all been missing. And that sentence alone sent a shockwave through the entire room. Imagine the scene. A glass-walled conference studio. Monitors flickering with live feeds. Assistants rushing past with papers and coffee. Editors reviewing footage with headphones hanging around their necks. All the normal noise of a newsroom. But the moment this insider walked in, everything slowed. Eyes widened. Conversations stopped. Even the hum of the air conditioning felt too loud. Because this was not just anyone. This was someone with access. Access to meetings that never get recorded. Access to conversations that never get transcribed. Access to decisions that never get documented publicly. Access to corridors where truth and narrative diverge quietly, intentionally, uncomfortably. And the look on their face, calm, steady, unflinching, sent one message loud and clear. They weren't here to speculate. They were here to confirm what had only been suspected. But here's what made the moment even more electrifying: the timing. This insider appeared mere hours after the palace attempted to shut down the emerging narrative, to smother the public's curiosity under a pile of corrections and scripted reassurances. Their arrival was not coincidence. It was consequence. An institution that tries too hard to silence questions eventually provokes someone who knows the truth to speak louder. The journalist conducting the interview sensed this instantly. They sat across from the insider, hands folded, recorder already running, heart pounding beneath a facade of calm professionalism. And the insider did not speak with urgency or fear. They spoke with something far more unsettling. Relief. Relief that someone finally asked the right question. Relief that the slip had opened a door. Relief that the truth, or at least a truth, no longer had to be carried alone. The insider leaned forward and began with something that sent chills through the journalist's spine. Before we talk about what's happened, they said, we need to talk about what never happened. Never happened? What kind of statement is that? What does it mean when the issue isn't what was done, but what was not done? And suddenly the journalist realized. This wasn't going to be a conversation about mistakes. This was going to be a conversation about omissions, about absences, about gaps in the narrative so large they could no longer be ignored. The insider continued, choosing their words with surgical precision. The problem isn't a single slip, they said. The problem is the pattern behind it. Pattern. That word hung in the air like smoke. Because patterns don't happen by accident. Patterns are connected. Patterns reveal intention. Patterns expose what's hidden between the lines. The journalist asked the only question that made sense. What pattern are you referring to? And the insider's answer was so measured, so calm, so unmistakably deliberate that it sent a ripple of unease through everyone within earshot. The pattern of things that should exist, but don't. They didn't elaborate. Not yet. They simply let that line sit, expanding in the mind like a slow-burning fuse. What things? What should exist? Why don't they? Each unanswered question sharpened the tension in the room. And that's when the newsroom phones began ringing. Not because of the insider. Because of the palace. The palace had found out about the interview, within minutes of it beginning. That alone was unsettling. How did they know? Who told them? Were they monitoring communications? Did they have someone planted inside the building? No one knew. But what everyone did know was this. The palace was trying to stop the interview before a single detail could be made public. Producers rushed into the room, whispering frantic updates into the journalist's ear. The newsroom's legal team began scrambling to anticipate possible threats. Emails flooded in from royal communications offices requesting, no, demanding, that the interview not air. Words like misinformation, security concern, and confidentiality violation were thrown around with increasing desperation. But the insider didn't flinch. They sat still, unmoved, unshaken, almost expectant, as if they knew this moment was coming, as if they had been waiting for the palace's panic to reveal the truth more loudly than their own words ever could. When the journalist apologized for the interruption and explained the palace's attempts to shut everything down, the insider simply smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a smug one, but a smile that said, "Now do you see?" And the journalist did see. The palace's panic was the confirmation they didn't know they were waiting for. The insider leaned back, exhaled, and finally began unveiling the puzzle piece that would fracture the narrative even further. What the spokesperson said on air wasn't the mistake, they explained. The mistake was forgetting how many people already know the truth behind the scenes. They slipped because they're tired of maintaining the story. Maintaining, not sharing, not correcting, maintaining. What kind of narrative requires maintenance? What kind of truth needs upkeep? What kind of institutional messaging needs to be rehearsed? The journalist, sensing the weight of the moment, asked, "Are you saying the official story isn't accurate?" And the insider didn't hesitate. Not for a second. "It's not inaccurate," they said slowly. "It's incomplete." Incomplete. Another smoke-thick word hanging in the air. The journalist pressed further. Incomplete how? And the insider's response was a quiet detonation. "There are events on the record for which there is no record." A beat of silence followed. Thick, heavy, unbearable. "No record?" the journalist echoed. The insider nodded. "None. Not even internal logs." "No. Not even private documentation?" "No. No photos." A longer pause this time. And then, "Not real ones. Not real ones." The phrase dropped like a stone into the room. The journalist's blood ran cold. The producer outside the room nearly dropped their headset. And somewhere in the building, a legal advisor muttered a quiet, horrified, "Oh my God," because that phrase, "not real ones," didn't sound like speculation. It sounded like confirmation. Measured, controlled, intentional. Before the journalist could ask the next question, before they could even process the implication, the insider raised a hand, as if to say, "There's more. You're not ready." And maybe they weren't. Because what the insider revealed next wasn't a detail. It wasn't a date. It wasn't even an explanation. It was a contradiction. A contradiction so blatant, so unignorable, so jarring that it rewrote everything people thought they knew. They pulled a document from their coat pocket. A simple page, printed, creased, anonymized. They slid it across the table. The journalist hesitated, then opened it. And as their eyes scanned the page, their face drained of color. Because the document listed an event, a major event, one that was plastered across headlines, one that had been celebrated publicly, one that had defined an entire chapter of the fictional royal narrative. And yet, on the second line, bold and clear as day, was a timestamp proving that the event had been announced before it was ever supposed to have happened. Not minutes before, not hours before, days, before the event was even on the schedule. How is this possible? The journalist whispered. The insider leaned in and said the line that would become the most repeated quote of the entire fictional investigation. Because the story was never meant to match the timeline. The timeline was meant to match the story. But before they could explain, before they could reveal how deep this timeline manipulation went, before they could connect the dots between missing evidence, contradictory dates, and carefully maintained narratives, someone from the palace made a final, desperate attempt to intervene. A message flashed across the newsroom monitors. A direct order. An unprecedented instruction. One that had never been issued in the network's history. Terminate the interview immediately. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. And maybe that's the most unsettling part about this entire fictional saga. The people who stepped forward weren't attention seekers, weren't disgruntled employees, and weren't desperate for relevance. They were quiet, composed, and unervingly precise. And the second insider, the one who chose to speak with a name and a face instead of a shadow and a whisper, didn't come with documents or footage or explosive leaks. No, they came with something far more dangerous. Questions. Sharp, surgical, impossible to ignore questions. Questions that struck at the soft spots of the narrative like a scalpel pressing against tissue. And with every question they asked, the palace's carefully woven explanations began to split like old stitching. Their interview wasn't dramatic. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't frantic or accusatory. It was calm, almost too calm. And that made it even more unnerving. Because in the world of royal PR, panic is expected. Composure is expected. But a quiet calm. A calm that suggests someone has been holding back the truth for years. That's the one thing no one knows how to handle. That's the one thing that sends shockwaves deeper than any scandal ever could. And let me ask you this. When someone publicly poses questions the institution can't answer, what does that tell you? Does it tell you the institution is innocent, transparent, confident, or does it tell you the exact opposite? Does it suggest there are things they desperately want to avoid, things they don't want the public thinking too hard about, things buried beneath layers of polished statements and choreographed appearances? Because in this fictional world, that's exactly the feeling that swept through the public. A slow, creeping realization that the palace wasn't defending itself because it was right. It was defending itself because it was cornered. The questions from the second insider were simple but devastating. Why were certain public events never documented beyond 1 or 2 controlled images? Why were timelines inconsistent in press releases? Why did official statements contradict previous official statements? Why did so many public appearances feel curated rather than natural? And most damning of all, why did the palace work so aggressively to shut down harmless curiosity? These weren't accusations, they were observations. Observations framed so carefully that the palace couldn't dismiss them without drawing more attention. Observations that forced people to re-examine years of public moments with new eyes. And the re-examination didn't go well. Because the deeper people looked, the stranger the inconsistencies became. Not subtle inconsistencies, not minor errors, but glaring irregularities, the kind you don't notice when you aren't looking for them, but become impossible to ignore once you are. It was like finding fingerprints everywhere after dusting a room that looked spotless for years. And now that the dust had settled, everything looked different. Everything felt different. Everything sounded different. Suddenly, the broadcast slip wasn't just a mistake. It was the starting pistol, the trigger, the moment that opened the door and allowed years of lingering questions to spill into the open. And what made the entire situation even more chaotic was the palace's reaction. They had 2 choices: dismiss the questions calmly or confront them strategically. Instead, they did neither. They doubled down. They pushed harder. They released more statements. They tightened their tone. They amplified their defensiveness. And in doing so, they created the exact opposite effect of what they wanted. People began wondering, why would an institution with nothing to hide treat every question like an attack? Why would they expend so much energy correcting something they claimed was insignificant? Why would they resist transparency on something so basic? And why, in the middle of all this, did they avoid giving clear, simple answers? Think about your own life for a moment. If someone asked you a harmless question, your birthday, your hometown, your job title, you wouldn't panic. You wouldn't get defensive. You wouldn't stumble over your words. You'd answer calmly, effortlessly, because the truth is easy to repeat. But when someone asks you something you don't want to answer, something that touches a nerve, something that exposes a story you've been trying to protect, that's when the panic kicks in. That's when the explanations become messy. That's when the defensiveness appears. That's when the contradictions start showing. And that's exactly the pattern the fictional palace fell into. The public felt it. They sensed the inconsistency. They sensed the fear. They sensed the urgency behind every sudden correction. And once people sense fear in a powerful institution, they start chasing whatever that institution is trying to hide. Not because they're malicious, not because they're obsessed, but because humans are wired to look for the truth. And when someone tries too hard to block your view, your first instinct is to lean in. And so that's what people did. They leaned in. Hard. They revisited events from years ago. They rewatched interviews. They studied old photos with a fresh perspective. They noticed background details they had never paid attention to. They questioned inconsistencies they once shrugged off. They connected dots they once dismissed as coincidence. And every time they dug deeper, the fictional narrative became murkier, more complicated, more tangled, like a web that had been spun quickly without expecting anyone to examine its structure. Meanwhile, the palace scrambled behind the scenes, or at least, that's what it looked like. More statements, more denials, more attempts to reframe the narrative. More pressure placed on media outlets to correct misinformation. But none of it worked, because by this point, the story had expanded beyond their control. It wasn't a rumor anymore. It wasn't a fringe theory anymore. It wasn't even a question anymore. It was a movement powered by curiosity, a movement powered by contradiction, a movement powered by the palace's inability to give a straight answer. And movements like that don't die quietly. They grow, they spread, they evolve. And that's exactly what happened here, because just when the palace thought they had contained the fire, just when they thought they had regained control, just when they thought the public would get bored and move on, a third insider appeared. This one didn't leave messages. This one didn't give interviews. This one didn't hint. This one didn't imply. This one provided something far more potent. Evidence. But not the kind the palace ever expected. And what that evidence revealed, well. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever witnessed a moment so ordinary, so routine?